weekend to talk to your friends who you haven't seen for a long time, but I would like to get started. It's great to see all of you. I talked to some of you earlier just about what's going on with the school, but there have clearly been some additions, so welcome. This is the opening session for our annual colloquium. It's titled Dollars, Development, and Diplomacy, Rethinking Foreign Aid and Policy, U.S. Policy. I should say that we hold the colloquium every year, and we really rotate between types of topics. Last year, we focused on the Great Recession. So we do a combination of domestic and international issues, and I thought it was a great time to turn our focus to development specifically. I should confess that I am, by training, a development economist, and I became interested in economics really because of the intellectual puzzle of why it is that some countries grow and others don't. Very hard question. This colloquium asks four very simple questions that you'll see reflected in the different panels. The first is foreign aid effective? And if so, why? And if not, why not? The second is, what's the growing role of philanthropy in international development? The third, what's the role of the private sector in foreign investment, trade, and development? And finally, we're going to return to the role of development policy in diplomacy. And Anne-Marie Slaughter will talk about those issues. These seem like simple questions. They do not have simple answers. There's a lot of debate and discussion. And they're also long-standing questions. One of the earliest development economists I read was Arthur Lewis, who was a professor here. Many of you may have had him if you're old enough. And more than 25 years ago, he gave the Richard Ely Lecture at the American Economic Association meetings, a very distinguished lecture. And his talk was titled A Review of Economic Development. And I'll read you a quote from him, which tells you a little bit about the questions that we're going to address. The quote is, "If we want foreign aid to show results in promoting progress towards economic dependence, it should be more closely linked to performance. These issues can no longer be evaded because the future of foreign aid is now critically in doubt, not only in the US, but even in France, where aid has heretofore been sacrosanct. Most aid is given for political reasons, and much of the current disillusionment springs only from belated discovery that political aid cannot achieve all that is expected of it. Nevertheless, it has to be admitted that the non-political aid is also distributed haphazardly, whether by bilateral or multilateral agencies. Better criteria and better results might win wider support." Now, this was over 20 years ago, and the aid scene has changed a lot since then. We've seen the rise of NGOs, the greater involvement of philanthropists in the aid community, and perhaps some of these issues have improved, perhaps they haven't. And it would be really great, we thought, to get a bunch of real experts in this area to talk about current thinking on these issues, and also hear from people in the audience who have been dealing with these issues over the courses of their careers. So I'd like to welcome our first panel, Professor Jennifer Widner, who is a political development specialist in the school, will moderate and introduce our speakers. So welcome.
So please let me add my welcome. As Chris explained, my name is Jennifer Widner. I direct the Woodrow Wilson School Bobst Center joint project, Innovations for Successful Societies. This is kind of idea bank for reform leaders who want to build very core government institutions in extremely challenging contexts. We chronicle innovative ways to improve effectiveness, enhance accountability, and escape some of the common governance traps that tend to subvert turnarounds in fragile states. We've left, I think, a few copies of the newsletter out on the press table for anybody who's interested in the work we do. And for community people, students who are here, we'd also like to invite you to a talk on Wednesday by the people who are writing the World Development Report this year, which is on conflict development, or conflict fragility and development. The focus of our first session today is on aid effectiveness. There are many debates in the development community about how to make assistance to developing countries more effective, whether to provide aid at all. Many of you are probably familiar with the very controversial book by Dambisa Moyo, Dead Aid. Some of the debates focus or tend to concentrate on the focus and impact of aid, about targeting. What are the real impediments to sustained growth, and where can outsiders make a difference? Should aid address financing gaps or institutions, for example, health or industrial development, or are these false dichotomies? Other debates focus on mechanisms or vehicles for delivery of aid. Should outsiders assist projects or focus on policy? Should they impose conditions or reward performance? And if they reward performance, is there a role for aid in places like South Sudan, a country just getting off the ground? Should aid target communities and provide sufficient resources to move residents over some sort of threshold, or do these strategies create dependency and encourage misuse of resources? Should the focus be instead on demonstration projects and diffusion of information? Should assistance to improve effectiveness target many institutions at once, because services in one policy sphere, like health, depend on services in another sphere, like roads or the civil service? Or is it possible to segregate one area from another and create examples that then diffuse? So we have two distinguished guests with us today to address their perspectives on these challenges. They're going to speak in reverse order. I think the new program has them flipped. First up is Professor Nicholas van der Wal. Nick has a Woodrow Wilson Ph.D., graduated in 1990. He currently directs the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell University and is the rising chair of the politics department, the government department at Cornell. Okay. He is a non-resident fellow with the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C., and the author of books and articles on many aspects of African politics. His books include Democratic Experiments in Africa, which he co-authored with Michael Bratton, the prize-winning book, African Economies and the Politics of Permanent Crisis, which I think is a fixture in all of our courses here, and more recently, Overcoming Stagnation in Aid-Dependent Countries. That's just a taste of what he's written. Our second panelist is Angus Deaton, who is Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of International Affairs and Professor of Economics and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School and in the Economics Department. Professor Deaton is recent past president of the American Economic Association. His current research focuses on the determinants of health in rich and poor countries, as well as on the measurement of poverty in India and around the globe. With Daniel Kahneman, he has also published a recent study of income and emotional well-being, the happiness studies, right? His engagement with the subject today is long and broad. In past years, his portfolio has included savings patterns and growth, inequality, poverty measurement, helped develop and author the World Bank Living Studies Standards Measurement Surveys, wrote the book on household income and expenditure surveys. Many of us use that still. Let me also say that we had a third panelist originally, Walter Crawford Jones, but he is unable to join us and sends his apologies. The recent events in North Africa have complicated his work on the agenda of the African Development Bank. Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt were among the largest borrowers and participants. So please join me in welcoming Professors van der Wal and Deaton.
Thank you. Thanks for that very nice introduction. I must say, I think the last time other than last night, the last time I was in this room was probably 1986 or so, as I come here, as students today often do, to listen to one of the many interesting people that the school brings in. And that year I didn't do so well on some of my exams, so I remember at least once thinking that I had no real potential for a career in policy and academia. So it's hugely gratifying to be able to speak here. And for those of you students, particularly PhD students, don't despair and survive graduate school. When I was here, one of the books that I read, I can't remember in which class, I think it may have been for John Waterbury's agricultural development class, We read Robert Cassin's Does Aid Work? And I hadn't looked at it in a long time, and I was looking at it a couple weeks ago. And what really was striking is that this book from the 1980s basically examined, with different degrees of success, most of the issues that we're still grappling with. And so when I was thinking about my presentation, I thought, well, let me think about what has changed and what hasn't changed in aid over a long period. And in fact, if you go back to the 80s, remarkably little has changed. And so I want to go back a little further and talk more broadly about aid from its beginning, although I'll focus on the current issues. Could we have the presentation? No. It's WWS. The colors are. The orange must be for Princeton. So I decided. Next slide, please. Or can I do this? So I want to somewhat, this is a rhetorical device. I wanted to say sort of 5 things that I think really have changed in the world of aid, and then 5 things that I think have fundamentally stayed the same. The changes are not necessarily good, so there's a decided tone of pessimism in my presentation. And my main question, that what I really want to end up with in my brief 20 minutes, is why has there not been more change? Now, I will have relatively little to say about the volume of aid. I will say that I think much too much of the debate about aid, or the debates in the plural, have focused on the quantity of aid. And the issue, it seems to me, is overwhelmingly one of quality, not quantity. I will also have relatively little to say about the impact of aid on growth, which is, I say 90% of the aid effectiveness literature is about that impact. I'm not an economist, so the econometrics got much too complicated for me over a decade ago. I will say, though, that I don't see what sustains this debate, since when you have 1,000 papers on one side and 1,000 papers on the other side, the most reasonable conclusion is that the impact can't be that significant, and you should focus on something else. So I'll focus instead more on political and managerial issues. Right, so the first, you'll have to trust me. So the first sort of, the first real change is the Africanization of foreign aid. Through the 60s and 70s, aid became Africanized. Since the 1980s, aid has been, or the share of aid going to Africa has been remarkably stable. At different times, it's been assumed that it would go down, either because Africa had too many dictators, or because Eastern Europe seemed much more attractive, or whatever. But the share of aid going to Africa has been remarkably stable after this initial Africanization, and it gets about twice what one would expect it to get because of its demographic share. So I'll go through some of these very quickly in the interest of time. If you have questions, we can discuss them a bit more. But secondly, over time, the importance of aid has become increasingly asymmetrical. Aid has become much more important to low-income countries as a share of the economy, as a public revenue. Its imprint on the local economy. I mean, you go to any low-income African country, and the donors are almost certainly the biggest sector of the economy. In terms of labor, for example, they're almost certainly the biggest employer, and certainly the biggest employer other than the government, since they pay for a lot of the government as well. That may be moot. But within the developing countries, aid has become more important. It's not unusual in low-income countries for aid to represent 15% of GDP. At the same time, aid has become much less important to the West as a share of public expenditure, as an objective of foreign and commercial policy. Aid is less important than it was in say, 1960, 1965. That's certainly true of the U.S., where, as we know, the U.S. used to be the overwhelmingly dominant donor. It's not anymore. Well, I'll return to that in a second. Okay, third general trend of change is that aid's relationship to the rest of of financial flows has really, really changed. Okay, so if you look at Africa today, ODA's worth is about 30 to 35 billion, but FDI, foreign direct investment, was 80 billion in 2008, so more than twice the level of aid. And remittances are inching up and are now almost the equivalent to foreign aid. Since so much of foreign aid doesn't get spent in the country, the macroeconomic effect of remittances is almost certainly considerably higher than the macroeconomic effect of foreign aid. Okay? Now, this is tricky. It's not necessarily the same countries getting aid and getting FDI, and there are these differences. But the point is we have evolved from a world in which foreign aid was specifically designed to substitute for private capital, which was not forthcoming to the low-income world, to a situation where aid should be thought of as a complement to private capital, as something that should be designed with foreign capital in mind in one way or another. So again, a fundamental change. Fourthly, aid agencies have been proliferating, and they continue to proliferate. I mean, the Bush administration all by itself generated several new aid agencies in the last decade. As a result of this, there's been a bilateralization of aid organizations. If you look at the beginning of aid, there was basically the U.S. as pretty much the only bilateral donor, and then there was the UN system and the Bretton Woods institutions. Pretty quickly, the ex-colonial powers were added, and then all the OECD countries were added. And now we're in a phase where we have new donors entering the fray, like China or Brazil. And then among the old donors, we have more fragmentation. So I saw a report recently that USAID only provides about 50% of American ODA. I was born in Belgium. Belgium, a country the size of New Jersey, now has, I think, 3 aid agencies. So this proliferation is a steady story of the history of foreign aid. Okay? Let me say also that part of this process of proliferation results in the decline of the U.S. as a donor, both in terms of how much of the total the U.S. gives, and as a sort of what I would say is as a source of development ideas and policies. It's really, really striking how absent USAID is from debates around the PRSP, for example, and other of the recent innovations that I will talk about. The US is still overwhelmingly the biggest bilateral donor, but it doesn't dominate the aid picture the way it did even 30 years ago. Fifth change, finally, and most obviously, it's been mentioned already in Chris's introductory remarks, is that the countries in which aid operates has really changed. And this is obvious, and I won't belabor the standard cliches about cell phones. But let me make 2 points, or a couple points that are often forgotten. One is that socialism is really dead. And I can remember doing field work in sub-Saharan Africa in the 80s, and getting just a sense of how strong various socialist doctrines were. And it's really true that in these countries, socialism and sort of socialist 5-year planning and so on is just not salient anymore to policy debates. I can remember a Zambian colleague telling me that FDI would be really bad for Zambia, and Zambia had to do everything it could to discourage FDI and instead pursue self-reliant development. Those kinds of things today, if you said that in Zambia, you'd be laughed out of the room. So I think that the ideological context has radically changed in most developing countries. Secondly, there's been a huge expansion in pluralism. Chris mentioned the rise of civil society, the increase in democratization, the movement to sort of regular multi-party elections as a default, the emergence of a free press. These are all new things that really have changed the picture. Finally, let me say the emergence of a professional class. I mean, famously, the average African country became independent in 1960 with 10 college graduates. Now it's hard to take a cab in any major American city and not have a cab driver be an African college graduate. So the picture really has changed, and the emergence of a professional class, unfortunately, too often not in Africa, but nonetheless, a very large cadre now exists of trained professionals. Let me move faster here because I'm running out of time. So let me talk about the continuities now. How has the other parts of the aid system dealt with these various changes? Well, the first continuity is that the project is still the modal mechanism for the delivery of ODA. And by project, I mean a discrete operation that starts at time X and has a 5-year period with budgets for 5 years, relies mostly, but although not entirely, on foreign expertise, and has systematic sustainability issues almost built into it, because at the end of the 5 years, it's not clear what happens. The origins of the project, it's almost certainly the 5-year plans, and the desire of the donors to sort of fit into these 5-year plans that stopped really existing in the 80s, but the projects continue. The projects have low effectiveness in general because they're very poorly coordinated with government budgetary and policy procedures. They result systematically in low ownership. Governments like the inputs they get with projects without necessarily buying into the objectives of those projects. So they see the project cars and the opportunities for things like patronage, even when they don't necessarily agree with the objectives of the project. Now, there have been timid attempts at reform to move away from projects. The PRSP process, which I mentioned, which has been going on, I guess, since the late 90s, various sectoral reform programs, and since 2005, a whole host of reforms suggested by the Paris Declaration. But if you look at all the non-project modes of aid delivery, it still amounts to about 25%. New donors, oddly, are totally enamored with projects. It's one thing about NGOs and a lot of the new non-governmental aid is it's overwhelmingly projectized. It's no evidence to suggest that a new donor like, say, Brazil or South Korea does any less in terms of projects. So second continuity, aid is still overwhelmingly given to national government in the low-income world. Very little aid goes to subnational governments. Very little aid goes to the private sector or the NGO sector. More problematically, very, very little aid goes to units larger than the national government. There's been a large literature about the importance of regional public goods, about how important it is to get rid of diseases or promote international cooperation in the developing countries. But the bottom line is very little aid still goes to these things. It's striking the extent to which, say, the IMF or the World Bank's policy dialogues doesn't take neighborhood considerations into account. Okay, I'm running out of time, so let me. Aid remains very volatile. This is something that we all know that's been true for a long time. This is a table. This you can see better. It's a table of aid to Tanzania, and it just shows the wild swings from year to year. Fourth, aid conditionality remains talked about and remains, I think, largely illusory. And I think the main reason for this is that donors do not coordinate. Contra Bill Easterly's cartel of good intentions, in fact, donors really don't coordinate their aid or their aid allocation very much. And so aid, even if specific donors have specific objectives for their aid, the overall allocation of aid remains remarkably random. And what we have had is a move to more and more micromanagement of aid, but that hasn't really increased leverage. I concede a little bit of improvement. The sort of Mobutus of the world don't get that much aid, although American aid is growing fast in Equatorial Guinea, and we can talk about that. Finally, capacity building remains the final frontier. It remains the puzzle that donors have not figured out. The old cliche about teaching people how to fish, well, it turns out it's really much easier to give them fish than to teach them how to fish. And there's been really remarkably little progress in our ability to build institutions. Despite this huge increase in the number of local professionals, it's not clear, and most indicators suggest that there has not been a commensurate increase in overall state capacity. And that, I would argue, continues to be a real mystery. I think one of the reasons I'll get back to that in a second. So why so little change? Why so little reform? Very quickly, the public debates still focus on quantity and not quality of aid. If you look at people like Sachs or Moyo, the debate at the UN over the Millennium Development Goals, overwhelmingly they're about the volume of aid. And the I think much more sensible Paris Declaration types of debates about how to reform the way in which aid is given, they tend to get drowned out. Secondly, there is no public constituency for better aid in the West. The state of debate about aid is lamentable, both in the US, in which people are against it without knowing much about it, as well as in Europe, where people are for it without knowing much about it. Next to last, the aid agencies themselves are not accountable. They at the bilateral level, they're typically not accountable to the general public, not accountable to the legislature, but accountable to a small set of interests that they've partly captured and partly been captured by. And as a result, they're protected from real systematic change. Finally, on the recipient country side, and I think if there is reform, it really would have to come from the recipient side. But there's this sort of, don't look a gift horse in the mouth kind of syndrome where governments, even if they don't approve of aid, figure, we'll get the resources. So there has been a fair amount of change. There has been a little bit of change. There's been a lot of debate in recent years, and I just want to talk about that for a second. The great aid paradox is that the countries that most need aid use it the least well. So it's clear that if you gave all your aid to, say, Switzerland, aid could really be effective. And so that's the great debate that donors go back and forth on, is whether they should reward good performance, give aid to the Switzerlands, I guess, or they're looking for what I would call the poor virtuous countries. Countries that are really poor but have an administration sort of like Switzerland's. And there are very, very few of these countries. And if you do that approach, you don't give aid to the countries that need aid the most. And unfortunately, because they need it precisely because their administrations are so deficient. The donors go back and forth. I mean, insofar as there's a serious debate in the donor world about aid doctrine, it's this back and forth pendulum between aid based on need and aid based on performance. Most of the recent aid reforms, I think, have gone too far on the selective side, although not necessarily hugely effective, but they really focus on giving aid where it can be most effective. And as a result, they neglect need-based. And I realize there's a genuine conundrum here for which I have no easy solution. But I would end by saying that the few genuine attempts at reform in the aid world have butted up against this dilemma and have not really resolved it all that well. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Hello. I'm delighted to be here. I've been teaching here for nearly 30 years now. As many of you will know, I come from Britain. I grew up in Britain as a good left-wing liberal. I thought, as I think now, that there's an overwhelmingly ethically strong case for redistribution from rich countries to poor countries. I also believe that even if you don't think in proprietarian terms or something of the sort, there's an overwhelmingly strong ethical case for assistance to people who are suffering in some of the most dreadful ways. So it's always seemed to me, as I think it seemed to most economists 30 years ago, that the case for aid was quite compelling. I've changed my mind almost completely over the last 30 years. I have not changed my ethical views about the need to do something for people who are suffering. I come, however, to believe that we're probably on average hurting those people rather than helping them through the way that the aid world works as of now. I should also say one of the things that has surprised me too as teaching here in the school is over the last 30 years, it's clear to me that the students have taken this view, taken this transition too. So as Nick says, not all that much has happened in the world of aid, but people's attitudes to aid, I think, has radically changed, certainly in the school, and certainly among many of the people I know. My friend Francois Bourguignon, who was the last but one chief economist at the World Bank, in a moment of unguarded candor said that when I took this job, meaning the job as senior vice president of the World Bank, I thought this was a problem in economics. And he said, I've come to believe now that this is not a problem in economics at all. This is a problem in politics. And I would very, very strongly endorse that view. And a lot of what I'm going to say now is things that I actually learned from Nick. And I thought he would have said them, but he didn't say all of them. So let me say one or two more things. Here are some of the things I'm going to talk about, some of the broad questions. The second last line there, which says politics and versus them, is a somewhat mysterious coded term. It's politics and us versus them. And I actually want to talk about us versus them and what it is we think we're doing when we're doing foreign aid. I want to say a few words too about experiments, since this has become very fashionable in economics today with people going out there and doing experiments and finding out how to do aid. I'll say a little bit about that. Let me start with this effectiveness of aid literature that Nick told you that he couldn't understand and then showed that he understands it absolutely perfectly well. I started out as a mathematician, I sort of became an econometrician, and then I became a development economist. It's this sort of slow softening of the brain. You get older. But I still don't know enough econometrics to be able to read this literature, and by God, is it awful. This literature is a literature in which technique is taken over from thought. What some of us refer to as technomorons. These are papers that are sort of full of sophisticated econometrics without any thought of where that sophisticated econometrics is coming from or how you're getting the results. And when you pull those apart to see why you get the results you get, there's nothing left. The basic problem you'd have thought of is the obvious one, which is if you look at the data, by and large, in a simple comparison, there's a slight negative correlation. More aid, worse outcomes. Well, of course, you'd expect that because we're trying to give aid to people who are doing very badly. Almost all the literature is about how you get rid of that problem, how you purge that out to the point somehow where you can look in situations in which you get a pure read on the effectiveness of aid. There are no such situations, or they're so special or so ridiculous that you really can't tell. So I don't think any study in this literature is directly credible. I could not give you a paper, nor could I write a paper, which would tell you what the answer is here. I'm not sure it's in the data at all. And lots of people then would argue that, we should just give up on this altogether. Having read this literature, though, my own reading is very much in line with Nick's, which is that there's less here than you would expect if aid were really effective. For example, there's no difficulty using these data to show that countries that invest a lot do better than countries that don't invest a lot. You don't see any of that for aid, no matter how you torture it or how you mess around with the thing. There are also lots of country studies where it's clear it doesn't work. Listed some of there are good reasons why you might see that happening, that we kept bad guys in power for a long time. There are lots of horror stories, and in fact, there's now an accumulating literature of horror stories associated with aid, which sort of parallels the horror stories associated with the colonial period. And I want to talk a little bit about that very uncomfortable analogy a little later in the talk. Others, and many of my friends who believe in the effectiveness of aid, argue that the question is just not answerable using these methods, and therefore we should stop doing this and think about other ways of finding out what happens in aid. So those people, and I'm thinking of people like Esther Duflo at MIT, Abhijit Banerjee at MIT, the good people at JPAL, they think that maybe it's true that aid doesn't work on average, but we've been failing to learn. And they point to, and I would point to too, this incredible series of fads that's gone through the development community over the years. If you go back to the 50s, Albert Hirschman wrote about how he was not allowed to work for the World Bank because he didn't endorse central planning. The World Bank is a central planning agency. Well, then it was industrialization, then it was infrastructure, then it was education and health, then it was getting prices right, then it was women, then it was social capital, then it's microcredit, and now we're sort of back to infrastructure. So it's infrastructure, as Nick said, is about phones. Used to be roads. Well, they're still back to dams. And we're really going to stop this circle. Now, one of the latest fashions, which I think is closer to being right, is governance. And we've come to realize that this is sort of a political problem, and all this technical gobbledygook that we were trying to do is just not the way into that problem at all. But the agencies, like the World Bank, are singularly unequipped to deal with governance. And there's very little sign of progress in that. Now, the experimenters, the JPAL people, argue that we would have learned and made progress if the bank and others had done more experiments, especially randomized controlled trials. And I don't believe that either. And if I get time, I will come back and talk a little bit about it. Nick talked a little bit about this, and this is part of the politics that's really important here. I don't think states historically have developed without developing a system of taxation within the country, which is some sort of contract between the government and the people to raise funds for service delivery and investment. It's a sort of compact for growth, which involves taxation. And the countries that Nick talked about, where overseas development aid is a large share of GDP and a much larger share of government revenue, this is basically inhibited. Governments have no need to raise taxes if you're getting 40 to 50% of your budget revenue from abroad. That makes, there's some issues here too about this gets worse in much of Africa where we're running under presidential politics, where there's no countervailing power of the legislature or judiciary. Presidents can rule with funding from abroad and a system of patronage, and they only have to keep the donors happy, not the citizens or their own legislatures. Here are some numbers which I took from some of Nick's work. In 2003, excluding Nigeria and South Africa, overseas development assistance was 12% of African GDP, and 36 countries have received more than 10% of GDP for the last 30 years. Again, this is Africa we're talking about, and many people see this as an aid curse, which parallels the resource curse. In countries that have a large amount of oil or a large amount of natural resources, that also gives the government who control these resources a way of avoiding the need to raise taxes, to have accountability to their own people, and leads to terrible outcomes. That's been true historically for 200 years, and it's clear that that is an important parallel. Now, if aid is really undermining the development of the institutions that are required for economic development, it's unclear if that's the big issue, then randomized controlled trials or experiments are not going to resolve that question. I mean, the randomized controlled trials are, you can't take countries and randomize over all those countries, and that's the level at which you have to do this. And finding out, whether a school or a clinic works is sort of beside the point. What about better or smarter aid? Smarter conditionality, ex ante or ex post. We could target governments, set term limits, the balance of powers, and so on. And as Nick had pointed out, and as he said a few minutes ago, this requires coordination among donors. And otherwise, when one country says, we'll only do this if you do that, then another country immediately comes in and fills the gap. So it's just basically impossible for one institution to do this. Now, of course, you can then have clubs of donors who get together and say, if you do this, I'll do this, and so on. I don't think those reforms can work. And I think the track record of them is very bad, and I think there's very good reasons for that. And that's because even if you look at what countries say they're doing with aid, there's no general agreement on what they do. Some of the countries put poverty reduction first. Other countries, including the United States, have never said that poverty reduction is the main reason for overseas development aid. And I think the key, which has really changed my thinking, is that aid is ultimately for us. It's not for them. Geopolitics is often important, as we all know, but people have said that if you switch from geopolitical issues towards the humanitarian agenda, that will make things better. And I don't think it does, is the answer. Because we're making ourselves feel better, not them feel better. And in fact, if you read the humanitarian literature about the necessity for aid, it basically blithely ignores the fact that we may actually be hurting people. And in fact, when it's clear we're hurting people, the humanitarian argument is so compelling that we have to go on doing it because it's ultimately about us and not about them. And if that's the case, then this is hopeless. This is not going to make the world a better place. So let me be a little cynical. Stop being serious. But I think in many cases recently we've seen aid as a whitewash for domestic issues, to cover our consciences, to make us feel better, or for unpopular leaders whose moral authority is being challenged. I mean, look at what happened in Britain with aid pouring out while Tony Blair was embroiled in the Iraq War, an enormously unpopular domestic war. This absurd competition among countries for the highest share of GDP, 0.7% of GDP, 1% of GDP. If you think about that, it cannot make any sense in terms of helping the countries. Because if the countries need it, it's nothing to do with the GDP of the rich countries, It's what the poor countries would need. And it's almost impossible for agencies to stop giving, even when aid is making things on the worst on the ground. And then the domestic politics changes these things. So last year, there was an election in Canada. There was a huge switch of aid away from HIV/AIDS towards mothers and children. You know, maybe that was justified, but it was not justified on the grounds of what was happening on the ground. It was on the grounds of what was happening in the Canadian election. I don't know how many of you have read Michaela Rom's terrific books about Africa, but one of the things in her latest book, the one about Kenya, she talks about the game really being up when the kleptocrats realized that the need of the West to give aid was even larger than their need to steal it. And, you know, once you get to that point, and, you know, this was the situation in which the British ambassador was being disciplined for screaming back to Whitehall and saying, stop this is making things worse. The World Bank representative is living in the Prime Minister's house and blocking all attempts to stop this. And, you know, this parallel with colonialism is something that deeply disturbs us. I mean, Bill Easterly's book makes that parallel very clear. But the motives are different. You know, we're not trying to get the minerals out of Africa anymore. But still, if we're doing this in order to make ourselves feel better, because we're good donors, then basically, once again, we're exploiting these people for our own benefit, not for their benefit. And so you better think that aid works, otherwise you've got no grounds for salving your conscience by doing this thing at all. And this thing that Nick talked about at the other end is very, very important. You've got this endless conflict between wanting to give aid to where people are really, really poor. But where people really poor are often in war-torn countries or things that are falling apart in which the aid cannot at all be effectively used. DFID recently had a review of the value that British taxpayers were getting from various aid agencies. And they had a simultaneous review of redirecting aid. And if you put those two things together, they're sort of amazing. Because on one side, it's saying we're going to stop giving money to the FAO after a time period or something, because the FAO is not delivering good value for UK taxpayers. But at the same time, we're going to switch aid to Mugabe, to Sierra Leone, to the places where people really need help. I mean, this is nuts. And as Nick says, this goes backwards and forwards all the time. That's a deep problem where there's really no easy solution. Now, these things do not always happen, but it's hardly a surprise that aid does not help on average. I wanted to say a few words. I'm running out of time, so I'll just indicate this. But I think it's worth looking back on the history of the population control movement. And it's very interesting to go back and read Peter Singer's famous argument on the paper on the ethical arguments for aid. He was partly talking about aid, but he was partly also talking about population control. We now look back on that as a tremendous misunderstanding, as a terrible embarrassment. There's a wonderful book by Matthew Connolly called Fatal Misconceptions, and the terrible price that was paid for our misunderstanding by Indians, Chinese, and women throughout the world. We had no idea what people needed, and we enforced our vision on a lot of people who suffered as a consequence. The mechanisms are different, but I think there's an ethical and moral parallel between what happened then and what's happening now. I guess I'm almost out of time. What can we do? The ethical imperative, I think, is really there. If we're doing harm, we should stop. I doubt that it's politically, ethically, or logistically possible to develop someone else's country from the outside. And that the attempts that we're making to do so are only hurting. I have a weak spot for health projects. And I think if you wanted to make a case for the effectiveness of aid, health is probably where you would look. There are a bunch of women and men in Africa who are staying alive because of antiretroviral therapies that would not have existed if the money had not come from abroad. On the other hand, the other issues I've talked about are present in health aid as well as in other aid. It's just the effectiveness argument seems to be somewhat stronger. I also would argue very much for these things that we can do, and I think they're really important things that we can do from the outside without domestically interfering in other people's countries. And these are things like international global public goods, trade opportunities, international legal arrangements, some of them are listed there, support in trade and international negotiations. Nick talked about remittances. Remittances is a terrifically important form of assistance and help that's probably very effective to many countries. We could make it easier for people from really poor countries to come to the United States, if only for a limited period. And that, I think, would be really helpful, and has been really helpful in countries where large numbers of Indians and Chinese and other people have come to the US. Probably the greatest gift the West has ever given to the South, to the rest, is the germ theory of disease, which was developed in Britain in the late 19th century, did not really reach the rest of the world until after the Second World War, and has given the enormous gift of life to millions of people who would not have otherwise had it, and that was not developed in the countries themselves, and I think that should probably be regarded as the sort of aid that we should try to emulate. All right. I'll talk about randomized controlled trials if someone wants to know about randomized controlled trials, but I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions, and we're asking you to come down to these microphones, if at all possible, and to state your name before you ask the question, because this is being taped. If it turns out you're caught in a row and you can't get out, if you can shout out your question, I will try to articulate it. But you're going to gamble on my abilities here. Yes.
I am Javed Khan, class of 77. I can fully agree with the title of your talk, Effectiveness of Aid, and I would sufficiently agree with your conclusions that it has been effective for the donors, but not for the recipients. And simply speaking, I would say aid is all about change. And Gandhi once upon a time said, if you want to change the world, you have to change yourself first. So in that context, I find that foreign aid has been a very effective tool of national policy in various areas, whether it's foreign policy, economic policy, political, etc. To that extent, the donors, particularly the governmental donors, have been very effective in achieving their objectives through foreign aid. And a very good example would be that currently in Pakistan,
we're going to try to get you to the question.
Okay, so the question is, if that's the state of affairs, then how can we stop this in terms of becoming much more favorable to the recipients and not continue, because it's very effective for donor governments in achieving their objectives in various ways, and they are doing it over a number of years, whether through multilateral institutions or bilaterally.
Would either of you like to take this?
I very much agree, and that's really what I've been saying. There's just this general, sort of parable that, if you give a gift to someone, of course it is likely to make you happy, but if the recipient is made happy too, you should not expect that. And if so, it's just a bonus. Many thank you. There has been no bonus here.
Dick wants to come in.
Yeah, so if I understand the question, it's the idea that aid hasn't been particularly good at developing these countries, but it has pursued other interests, commercial and foreign policy, where it has been more effective. And I actually think that's far from clear. I mean, most commercial policies of the U.S. vis-a-vis Africa have not promoted the general welfare of the U.S. They've catered to special interests in the U.S., like the farm lobby. And I think American foreign policy, support of Mobutu in Zaire for 30 years, it was for a long time the leading recipient of American aid. I think one could very much contest that was an effective foreign policy. So I think and maybe that should be the larger frame, is looking at the overall effectiveness of the U.S.'s relationship to the South, which I think has been underperforming on multiple fronts.
Wonderful. We have quite a lineup here, so we're going to ask you to be brief. Thank you.
Hank Gassner, class of 65. In looking at the development of the world, I was wondering if you might be overlooking some of the success stories. The effect of research in miracle rice and miracle wheat, without which I think much of the developing world would not be able to feed itself. The assistance in reduction in the fertility rate, which I think has made a big difference in some of the success stories. And people, I think, were talking about some of the change in the thinking in the developing world, and one of the byproducts of the aid dialogue, hopefully, has been the transmission of ideas as to what is effective for developing economies and whether this has been effective in making some of the developing countries adopt policies that are better attuned to what would help them develop.
I very quickly mostly agree with that. But most of the examples you gave are technological or scientific advances. We're not talking about aid from governments to governments or projects on the ground. I think the great contribution to fertility reduction was the decline in mortality, which came from the germ theory of disease spreading to the world, and that that caused a temporary population explosion, which we're seeing the end of now. But fertility rates fell very rapidly in time.
Yeah, I mean, the Green Revolution, I totally agree on its importance of population. I think if you add those areas that the gentleman spoke about, you get to probably much under 10% of the ODA flow since 1950. So it's, and indeed, support for Green Revolution type things has been declining steadily since it peaked, I think, in the 1950s. So.
Thank you. Next question.
A kind of assistance that we haven't talked about, but I think is on the minds of the general public, is that of disaster assistance. And since this is something that you probably have broader public participation, just because at any given time when there's a disaster, there's all kinds of aid campaigns. If you can speak to the efficacy of that kind of assistance, and whether or not different sectors are more effective, nonprofit versus governmental and so forth.
It's a terrifically important question, and it's clear that the humanitarian assistance through NGOs has now become extremely large. I think it's about 30% now of all total aid flows. It's totally unregulated. There are many, some of the worst horror stories come out of places like Goma or Sierra Leone or even Biafra going back into the 1960s, which are all involved humanitarian aid, particularly when they get involved with war zones. And that actually goes right back to when Florence Nightingale opposed the setting up of the Red Cross on the grounds that it would make war easier and facilitate greater war. That's a very, very old debate. On the other hand, the horror stories get all the publicity, and it's hard to believe that it's not a good idea to send people to help in Haiti, for example, or to help to deal with various natural disasters. One of the things I should say about that is because it's so unregulated and so unmeasured, we really know very, very little about it. I mean, in terms of quantitative measures of how much is being spent, the measures of effectiveness, and so on. And obviously, in these emergencies, it's extraordinarily hard to do that sort of measurement. But it's a major and very troubling issue to a lot of us. And it's clear that humanitarian aid is not exempt from the issues we've been talking about here, but the balance might still be much more in favor than it is for the longer volunteer.
Sean Powers, second year MPA. Thank you very much for your remarks. Both of you had nice things to say about remittances, and I guess I count myself as a skeptic of remittances. I worked on this little issue a little bit in the Philippines for both substantive and methodological reasons. From what I saw, remittances have a lot of the same problems as aid does in terms of fostering dependence, promotion of migration being a substitute for other kinds of government policy. There is a literature on remittances and development, but it's just as shoddy as the macro literature on aid and growth, shot through with a lot of the same problems and giving equally contradictory answers. So my question is, on what grounds do you think remittances are any better?
I don't think, I certainly don't think either Angus or I would argue that remittances are some kind of magic bullet. I think what we both tried to emphasize was the importance of human capital flows across borders, and that in general the sort of international regime over the last 40 years has really pushed for the promotion of capital mobility, but has done very, very little to increase the mobility of labor, which I think ultimately is more beneficial to these countries. That remittances are not always well used, that they sort of suffer the vicissitudes of bad macro policy locally. So, you know, too much of the remittances go into buying houses or building houses, not enough go into productive investment. That probably is almost always linked to local macro policy and local sectoral policies by governments that don't promote productive investment. But nonetheless, remittances are part of the human capital story, and human capital development and flows are I think, underexploited by the international community.
I think it's not necessarily the remittances per se, and once again I'm agreeing with Nick, but I mean if you think of the Kennedy administration basically made it possible for large numbers of well-educated Indians to come to the U.S. For the first time. Prior to that, there were almost no Indians in the U.S. It's hard to believe that the growth of India that's happened since 1990 would have happened if that had not happened. And you can tell similar stories about China. And I think a lot of the high points in Africa are to do with that human capital that's come here or come to Europe and then gone back to Africa. So it's not so much the monetary remittances, which I think do have to follow, as the flow of human capital and the ideas. I mean, if the U.S. was really serious about getting the third world not be poor, it would open its borders to them. I mean, almost all economists will tell you that, all this trade, all this aid, there's nothing is as effective as allowing immigration. That ain't going to happen. And so you could argue that we're not really serious about doing this. And there's obviously some limit to which that's achieved.
Now, both of you arrived at the microphone at the same time, so.
I was just wondering if you could talk more about how well aid is coordinated with U.S. policy during revolutionary movements. Obviously, this is a very relevant topic now, and I'm just wondering if you think it's more effective practically and maybe ethically more appropriate when there are the conditions of a movement for revolutionary democratic change.
I'm an economist. I only talk about politics when it suits me. I think you probably have the same puzzlement that we all have right now, in the sense that there's terrible dangers in what might happen here. And, I think we would have a lot of different views and diversities of opinion around this room as to what we've been doing there is wise or unwise. And perhaps history will tell.
Maybe I can just say a word on this too.
Yeah, that would be
So in Innovations for Successful Societies, this is something that we think about a lot, because we're often finding that in these moments, you have a reformer who comes to power. very uncertain base, but there's motivation, there's political will, and the question is how very rapidly can you assemble information that would be useful to that person in introducing the reforms and sustaining them. So we found that the King's office in Jordan is printing our cases and distributing them left and right, and the same is happening in some other areas right now. We don't know that this is going to be enduring, but at least you have to deliver something very, very rapidly and figure out how to structure an organization very quickly, and to be able to learn from people in like parts of the world, from fellow reformers in these countries, becomes very important at those moments. You don't have the time to leave the country, you can't leave the country, and you don't have the time to make the phone calls, so we try to do that for them.
The Woodrow Wilson School is taking credit for
No, we're not.
King in our...
No. But we could tell him how to make some of his ministries work a little bit better.
Hi, Gail Hodges, class of '98 undergraduate program. I should disclose first that I work for HSBC, and I lead our mobile payment strategy, which is part of where my question came from. And I think, Angus, the point you made around the trend of mobile, and we see incredible mobilization across all markets and all consumers in the use of their mobile phones. And you see these trends in emerging markets as well, I mean, remittances and trying to reach mobile payments. So I guess the question is how you see the transformation of the mobile phone and actually being able to track beneficiaries at a very detailed level. That could be for health programming with women and children, it can be receiving of payments, and it can also be any other form of tracking of that on a programmatic level. Just thought you could comment.
That's a terrific question. I think we both sort of make fun of telephones without probably meaning to make fun of telephones. Well, I make fun of telephones. Actually, I mean, I've thought about this in a sort of fairly general way. We have a temptation when we teach economic development, or when people sometimes write about economics, to do what Arlen Thornton thinks of as reading history sideways, which is like you sort of see, you think, you go to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and you say, this is what England was like in medieval times. And the answer is that's just completely wrong. I mean, the income levels may be very similar to one, but there's lots of technologies which leap across this gap and which don't require income change in order to be enormously effective. So vaccination from the germ theory of disease is one classic example, where you don't need to be rich to vaccinate kids. And you know, there were huge increases in life expectancy throughout West Africa, throughout Africa in the 50s, at times when those countries, nothing else was happening in these countries. So I think of mobile phones as one of those technologies that are relatively cheap enough that can make a huge difference. But how big a difference, you know, they're really going to make. And it makes sense for people who are deeply involved in this to be messianic about the gifts that cell phones are going to bring. And we will see. But there's certainly a track record of those sort of cheap inventions changing people's lives. And, you know, people in medieval England were not watching test cricket matches on their mobile phone. And people all over India today are.
Let me add, I mean, I agree, and I just, I didn't want to dismiss something, it seemed to me that in this audience, it was probably one of the examples that people already use, so I wanted to talk about maybe less intuitive things. You know, the striking thing about the cell phone industry, and Mo Ibrahim came to Cornell, and he's one of the founders of the biggest cell phone network in the region. And the striking thing is how little aid had to do with its development. How not only, you know, the bank, say, but even IFC gave very, very little money, if any, to cell phones until it was clear that they were going to work. Mo Ibrahim told us that overwhelmingly in the aid business he was discouraged and said, you know, can't work in Africa. So it's again, I think not. I mean, since we're dumping on aid today, it's not an area I think where aid was particularly forward-looking.
I think we have time for one more question, so it's yours.
Suzanne Salomon, MPA 71. As foreign aid is declining arguably from governmental sources, a slowly emerging trickle of a trend is impact investing and trying to encourage entrepreneurship in developing countries. For example, an organization called Vision Spring trains women in villages to how to test vision and provide very low-cost eyeglasses to people and then support their families and so forth. Do you see this as an increasingly emerging trend? And if so, how can it be institutionalized in the poorest of the poor countries, which fundamentally don't have the structures to support this kind of activity?
Would like to go first.
Well, there's certainly, I think it's bigger already than you think. There are hundreds of thousands of NGOs around the world that are doing that, many of them very successful in raising funds, and there's a lot of money that comes in that way. And as the example you gave, it's not always money, but some idea that actually may make a difference. Again, I don't know, I don't have a view on what the overall balance of, benefit and cost has been for these organizations. We worry about them because they're not under any sort of central monitoring, and you get awful ones who are doing awful things, as well as ones that are doing really good things. But it's hard to get away from, the anecdotes and the press reports and the books that people write about bad or good experiences with these things and get some overall assessment. You certainly wouldn't want to choke off all this innovation that's going on, if only because some of it's really going to work.
Yeah, I agree. This is a good question, and the last of many really good questions. I would say two things. I mean, there's a plethora of these organizations, and at worst, it's the kind of tourism. I mean, if you look at the numbers, I saw numbers on faith-based organizations and how many Americans from faith-based organizations go to sub-Saharan Africa. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. And I think that's on balance, that's good, even if it doesn't have developmental impact. I think in a policy context, there are two issues that we have to focus on, and on which we don't have many good answers. One is the ramping up problem. These are tiny little organizations. They have activities in one village that can be hugely successful, but how do you ramp up? How do you generalize? They tend to be very management intensive, so can you ramp up? Or do you rely on that really good person, from the church in Nebraska who's just fantastic at running this little activity? And the other thing is sustainability. How, when the church decides that it's no longer interested in water, but now wants to work on something else in another part of the world, how do you sustain the good that it's done? And I don't think we have. I mean, I think this is something that we need to focus much more on than we have. We don't really have answers.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you'll join me in thanking the speakers. I know there were a lot more questions out there, so there may be a break where you can come up to the speakers and ask questions.